Sorry, I'm just waiting for people to, people are coming in. Sorry. Okay, I think that's it. I just need to, yeah, I just want to make sure that everyone can see. Okay, I want to make sure everyone can see you. Welcome everyone to Lagos Fashion Week's Fashion Business Series 2020. It's been a very interesting year for us, you know, with COVID, not COVID, and SARS and the unrest that happened afterwards in Lagos. But it's very good to be back on schedule and to start doing things again in terms of, you know, Fashion Week and the things that we normally bring, you know, towards the fashion season. So I would like to introduce a very, very amazing keynote speaker for Fashion Business Series this year, Francois. Francois started working with the Ellen McArthur Foundation in 2016 and with its global partners, Google and H&M, to help drive the circular economy innovation. He has a lot of experience in terms of making fashion circular. He's the Make Fashion Circular lead at the Ellen McArthur Foundation, and he's basically shaping a program that is disruptive, that's a disruptive force within the industry to basically, you know, push sustainability forward in the fashion industry globally. So we're very excited to have you. I'm really looking forward to the learning that we'll have. So for this session, what we'll do is Francois will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then afterwards I'll ask him a few questions, and then any questions that you have, you can either put them in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand if you sort of want to ask him a question to speak to him directly, and then we can sort of, you know, have a conversation about, you know, making fashion circular and making things work and helping the planet and people. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Francois.
Nice, thanks a lot, Deborah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today, and I'm really excited about the conversation we are going to have over the next hour. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your learning series today. So should we start with just an introduction to circular economy? What does it mean for fashion? What are some of the things that we see happening across the world when it comes to circular economy? So I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can see the slides pretty well. When that happens, I can't see anything else happening on my computer, so I just have to trust that it works. Cool, so the Ellen McArthur Foundation, just a quick intro. We are a charity. We're based in the UK. We work globally, and our mission is to accelerate the transition towards a circular economy. And we've got a number of programs to do that across multiple industries. And my role at the foundation is to manage the work we are doing with the fashion industry. So the first question you may ask is, what is the circular economy and why do we need to move towards one? So the best way to talk about a circular economy is to kind of look at how things are working today. Today, the economy works in a very linear way. We take stuff off the ground, often from like finite sources, we transform them into products that we use less and less before discarding them into landfill or incineration. And today, a very tiny fraction of all that it ends up being reused or recycled. And this linear economy is causing massive challenges for the world. I mean, it's got enormous amount of value destruction. It's destroying ecosystems. It's creating pressure on climate and biodiversity. So at the foundation, we think that a circular economy can provide a solution to tackle the root causes of global challenges like climate change, like pollution, like biodiversity loss. And the way in which we look at a circular economy at the foundation is based on 3 principles: design out waste and pollution, like use products and materials more, and regenerate natural systems. So I'll just dive into those 3 principles for a minute because they're important and they really underpin all the thinking that we have at the foundation regarding a circular economy. So the first principle is to design out waste and pollution. And what that means is basically to kind of look much more broadly at the product conception and to extend the brief that we have, not only to look at form and function, but also to look at what's going to be the impact of making that product and how can we make sure that this product doesn't generate waste when it's being produced, but also will not end up as waste when it's not used anymore. So starting to think about what comes next and what's the end game for that product from the outset. The second principle of a circular economy is to keep products and materials in use. And basically that's where a huge part of the economic opportunity of a circular economy lies. It basically moves from creating value by selling once, often at a discount, and trying to get people to buy more and more and more frequently, to actually generating value from the product itself by increasing its use. And that can happen through product as a service, for example. So instead of selling a light bulb, you start selling light and actually managing the lighting for a company. But also it can come through ensuring that the materials that enter the economy stay within the economy, so that when you have a product that enters the economy, once people stop using it, you can recover that product, recover its materials, and put them back into new products. That an example of that that's quite famous is, for example, what Apple is doing with their iPhone, and actually the capacity they have to take them back, disassemble them, and recycle their valuable materials like aluminum. And the third principle is to regenerate natural systems. Put in a simple way, like as my mom would say, it's kind of like leave the place cleaner than you found it. It's if you need to grow something, make sure that you can grow it over and over again over several generations rather than depleting the soil. And what we saw when we did a study on food systems a few years ago is that basically we are degrading the topsoil on which we rely to grow everything from our food to our cotton at an unprecedented rate. And according to current trajectory, some experts predict that we only have 50 to 60 years left of capacity to grow stuff on the topsoil if we continue degrading it at the pace at which we're degrading. So making sure that we can regenerate that system. And that can come from protecting biodiversity, changing agricultural practices, but also making sure that the natural materials that we are using can be safely returned to the ground as nutrients and restore the quality of the soil. So that's a lot of the work that we've done at the foundation is to try and understand what's the opportunity of that framework? How are those three principles helping to kind of improve how the economy works? And one thing that we've seen over and over again through our studies is that the circular economy is a global opportunity. It's an opportunity in Europe, in the US, in China, in India, and every time this opportunity is significantly bigger than the opportunity presented by a linear economy when you project it to 2030 and 2050. And in addition to that, a circular economy can provide a valuable framework to tackle challenges like climate change. One thing that we modeled last year was how much energy efficiency and renewable energy would get us on the way towards the 1.5 degree trajectory, and how much more effort is needed. And what we saw is actually transitioning to renewable energies and implementing energy efficiency solutions solves 55% of the challenge to get towards that 1.5 degree trajectory. The other 45% will have to come from changes in the way we produce, use, and reuse products, which can be answered by circular practices. Now, the real question is, how is that global framework of a circular economy, how does it apply to fashion? What does it mean for the fashion industry? And over the past 4 years at the foundation, we've worked a lot on the fashion industry. And one of the things that we saw is that first, the fashion industry is currently a very, very linear model. Over 97% of the materials that are used by the fashion industry are from virgin sources. And out of those materials, over 60% are coming from oil through plastics. Now, when we make clothes, there's a lot of waste that's happening through the production, but even more so during the use. One of the things that we saw is over the past 15 years, so basically between 2000 and 2015, so at the time of the report, the global production of clothing had doubled, but the average number of times people were wearing their clothing had decreased by close to 40%. So we produce more and more clothing and we use it less and less. And what that results in is vast amount of clothing that are directed to landfill or incineration. We estimated that every second, there's the equivalent of a rubbish truck of clothing that is sent to a landfill or incineration. And only a tiny, tiny fraction of clothing will be collected, often to be cascaded into making insulation for cars or stuffing for furniture, and less than 1% of all clothing will be turned back into new clothing. So a very, very linear model of taking virgin materials, using them less and less, and throwing them away. And in addition to the challenges that this model is causing, there's also some significant changes that we see happening within society that are really questioning that current linear model. So it's not just material and environmental considerations, it's also a growing disalignment between how the industry operates and the expectations of people that makes the case for a change happening now. There's more and more awareness within society about the broad impact of human activity on the planet, and there's more and more kind of expectations from people for their brand, like the brands that they like to take action and meaningful action to solve those problems. The lifestyles are changing and people are living busy lifestyle and receiving tons of stimuli through their lifestyle. So actually seeing through the noise and making choices that can be simple is more and more important. There's also like that broad kind of aspiration that we mentioned about, like, I want to be part of the solution. I want to be a positive contributor to the planet. There's a lot more about me and the kind of the more individualistic aspect of identification, and that comes through willingness to have customized experience, individual specificities for the products that people buy. And then there's the entire thing about transitioning from a product-centric spending towards more experiences. like we've seen that coming over the past few years. A significant part of the disposable income of people has moved from buying stuff into experiences, into living, basically. So all that is kind of also making a case for a broader change in the way in which the industry operates. And basically what we've done, and we've published a vision very recently that you can access on our website, is try to understand how the three principles of circular economy can be applied to the fashion industry. And for us, that means that for fashion, apparel, footwear, and accessories are first used more to really start tackling overproduction and overconsumption by providing new business models and more durable clothing. It also means that they're made to be made again. That is, thinking about what comes next for their products from the beginning, making sure they can be disassembled, that their components can be recycled, but also that the appropriate infrastructure are in place so that it can happen in practice. And finally, that the materials that make our clothes are safe and recycled or renewable. And that means safe, it means they don't cause any hazard to either the environment or people who are working in the fashion supply chain, or even the people who wear the clothing. But also they are coming primarily from recycled sources, which means that increasingly our clothes will be made out of old clothes. And when that's not possible, they come from renewable materials that have the potential to regenerate the ecosystem in which they're being grown. And so that may feel a bit like theoretical or a bit like high level. So we've tried to put some examples or questions to stimulate the conversation and bring it to a bit more reality and tangible. So the first aspect of how do we move on to using clothing more can be asking ourselves, what if our clothes had several lives? What if they had several owners? And how can we make sure that the clothing we create can be attractive and desirable, not only for the first owner of the shells, but for its second, its third owner? How can it age better? And there's tons of new companies that are being set up and that exploit the decreasing stigma that exists on wearing secondhand clothing, at least in North America and Western Europe. So we see Vestiaire Collective, The Real Real, or Depop, and all have very different approaches. Vestiaire Collective, they look at luxury consignment. So they get luxury products, authenticated, and they put it on a platform that looks very much like a luxury online platform to purchase products. And then you've got Depop, who's on the other side of the spectrum, very much focused on Gen Z, empowering people to become their own entrepreneur and to sell their clothing and start trading their clothing and start market kind of their own clothes to be able to resell it on the platform. And what we saw is that those business models are very much powered by the digital revolution. What makes those possible is the simplicity and ease there is to take pictures of your product, to order collection, and to sell or buy on the platform, because you can search, because it's much easier to navigate than going to a former thrift, what a thrift shop is, which doesn't necessarily fit the expectations and the shopping aspirations of the vast majority of people. The second question that we can ask ourselves is, what if we no longer owned our clothing, right? We've got a lot of appreciation for what we have, but do we really need to own all our clothing, and what does it bring? We see that transition happening, for example, in the car industry, where more and more cities are implementing car sharing systems rather than having everyone own their car. And for clothing, we see more and more companies actually coming up, whether it's companies that have the inventory and rent it to their customers, like Rent the Runway, whether it's companies connecting companies that have inventory with customers who want to rent their products, like Y Closet in China. Y Closet is present in many cities in China, has more than 20 million active subscribers on their platform. And there's also new startups that are coming up and that actually allow for peer-to-peer rental. So if I've got some stuff in my wardrobe that I'm not necessarily using on a daily basis, I can actually rent it to people who want to use it for an evening or a day. And that helps create revenues for me, like justify maybe buying something a bit nicer than I would have otherwise, and prevent someone else from having to like buy a new piece of clothing, also thus contributing to increasing the average utilization of clothing. And the last question is, what if our clothes were made to be remade? How would that look like? How can we think about creating something that from the outset is made to look great, is made to last, but is also made to be remade? And there's a great example that you've probably seen from Adidas, who has created this shoe called Futurecraft Loop. Some innovations took 6 years in the making because they wanted that shoe to be 100% made of the same type of plastics, making sure that the entire shoe and even its plastic bag in which it comes when you order it to deliver or when you send it back, everything can be shredded, melted, and recreated into a new shoe. And actually, they've created different versions of that shoe. The first one was 100% virgin to control the quality of the materials, but they created a second version that had 10 to 20% of recycled materials from the previous generation of shoes in it. And one thing that's very interesting is, in order to make sure that they could recycle the materials at the highest quality, they had to rethink the entire process of creating that shoe. So they removed all the glue, because glue contaminates your material stream when you shred and recycle, to ensure that it was like created without glue and completely like sealed and soldered. So a really nice innovation story. But there's also Atelier and Repair, who's kind of remaking clothing and ensuring that clothing that would otherwise go to landfill can actually be used much longer. So they use traditional sewing techniques and crafts in order to bring a new life into clothing that would otherwise not be seen as wearable anymore. And the last example that I wanted to share with you is a project that we've done with the Ellen McArthur Foundation called the Jeans Redesign, where what we did is bring together over 80 experts on jeans and ask the question, what if we want to make a pair of jeans that's fit for a circular economy today? What would that look like? What would be the criteria that we put on this pair of jeans? And what we came up with is a set of guidelines around 4 areas. The first one is make sure that they're super durable, that they're tested so that the fabric can last a very long time, but also that we communicate clearly to the user of that pair of jeans that they need to take specific like practices when they want to wash it. So wash less often, wash cold, don't tumble dry, etc. The second part is around the materials that are used, making sure that the materials are safe, are renewable, or are recycled. So making sure that it fits within certain standards in terms of chemical use, making sure that the cotton that is used in the jeans comes from organic or in transition sources. And finally, making sure that some of the most chemically intense processes, like making the jeans look distressed or the electroplating to make some of the rivets, is phased out. The third aspect was to make sure that the jeans are recyclable. So what we did is look at all the recycling technologies that we could find and make sure that the fabric that is used in the jeans meets the criteria for recyclability for the recycling technologies, but also make sure that it can be easy to disassemble. So limiting the number of rivets, making sure that zips and buttons are easy to remove, making sure that if you put a leather patch at the back, it can also be easy to remove, so that the vast majority of the fabric could effectively be recycled. And the last aspect was traceability and making sure that those jeans can be easily identified. There's a lot of energy that went into creating them. And so what's important is that when they're collected, they can be identified to be sent to the right next step for this pair of jeans. So making sure that there's a logo or a technology in it that enables the identification of this pair of jeans. So that's this project. Today we've got over like nearly 70 companies ranging from fabric mills, garment manufacturers, and brands who are part of it, and who will put a lot of jeans on the market between now and May 2021. And that's it for me.
That's great. Oh, sorry. That's great. I think that was really interesting. And I really liked, the part about, the genes. And a general question would be, in terms of working in this sector, in terms of sustainability, how much progress do you think we've made in terms of like what the goals now are and what we're expecting for 2050, for example?
That's a very good question. So one thing that we've seen is how the conversation and the strategies have changed over the past even just 2-3 years, where initially a lot of the conversations on sustainability and circular economy were focused on the materials, so making sure that it was like coming from either recycled plastics or good sources for cotton, but also like thinking about like only recycling and just pushing for innovation in recycling technologies and not necessarily thinking about how product consumption actually needs to align with recycling. And all that has moved quite a long way, where we see more and more companies putting circular collections on the market where they've actually taken considerations on the durability, on the recyclability of their products. We see also more and more companies being open to rethink their business model. That wasn't necessarily the case a few years ago, but now we see more and more companies having pilots or new branches that are looking into resale or remaking or reselling. So I think there's a huge amount of exploration that has happened. Now what's really important is to make sure that those lead to real transformation and at scale.
Great, thank you. And there was something else I picked up, and Yassine from Senegal has literally just brought that up. So in your map, you showed us, what the US is saying, what Europe is saying, what Asia is saying. Is there any data on, the circular economy in Africa in terms of fashion?
That's a very good question. So there's more and more companies that are looking, like companies and NGOs that are looking into that. I know that we are looking into that, not necessarily to create like a big study, but to have more examples and to have more like data points on the opportunity for Africa. I know that there's other organizations like UNEP that are looking into it. So there will be definitely a lot more that is coming in the coming years, I'd say, and that's really exciting.
Cool. I know that for us, as Africans, and I'll speak on behalf of African designers here, I know that for us, we already know that we're sustainable because creating fashion in this space, it's very hard to not be sustainable. So, your brand that's based in Europe would get their product from China, but living in Nigeria, it's stressful, but it's actually easier to just get your products made here. We do appreciate that, going the extra step would then be not using imported materials and finding the materials that are, local to you, so that you're also saving on carbon footprint and all of these things. But, what would you say in terms of sustainability is the future for African designers? What direction do you think African designers should focus on, apart from, the people impact in terms of employability?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and definitely the people impact is a very important one. What we see as quite an important aspect of the transition towards like a fashion industry that can like thrive over the long term is really understanding how you can get more use from the product. And I think one of the things that we saw is often because of like economic pressures, when you start your company, you use like dead stock fabric or you have limited collections, and all that kind of like increases the use of materials. But then as you grow, you need to use more virgin, and then you may have investors or people that put pressure for you to grow faster. And then the trick is to try and churn out more products. And I think finding alternatives to that can lead to actually creating products that are used more, and like renting or reselling or celebrating your own kind of archives, right? As a creative is really important, and actually kind of avoiding the kind of linear trap that is, as you've got pressure to grow, just use the classic toolbook of putting more on the market is quite important.
Okay, and I think that you might be alluding to the answer for my next question, but I would say that in terms of sustainability, we always feel that, you know, sustainability isn't affordable. And we appreciate that, because if you're taking all these extra steps, something has to give, and it always ends up giving on the price tag. I mean, I can name a number of non-African designers that, you know, we love their work and we think it's amazing, but then in terms of how much does it cost to actually support a sustainable designer, for example, like Bethany Williams, who does, you know, amazing circular work, at the end of the day, the price tag is not so affordable to the normal person. So what would you say, how do you think sustainability and affordability meet in terms of being a consumer? How do you buy or shop more sustainably?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so there's a few aspects of that we've kind of seen. The first one is, the more people, the more organizations, the more brands, the more like manufacturers move towards more sustainable and circular practice, the more scale you have, and actually the more we can have those economies of scale and those economies of learning that will come. We always say, like, today we're competing against an economy that was optimized over 150 years, right? I mean, since the second industrial revolution, and even more so since the Second World War, we've been optimizing the system to like make sure that we can produce at the lowest possible cost in order to churn out vast amount of product and incentivize a sort of throwaway life where people just don't really care and like throw away. I really like actually this catchphrase from Adidas saying like, we think we throw it away, but there's no way, right? Like it doesn't really exist away. So I think there's something about the more people do it, the easier and the cheaper it would be for everyone to do it. The second thing is, indeed, there's a sort of transition phase for that will mean that some products are slightly more expensive. But what we see is, effectively, when we've done the jeans redesign project, what we see is like nearly all of the brands that are part of the jeans redesign are able to sell their jeans at their traditional selling point. So like they're able to like perform environmentally, and because effectively in the overall price of a garment, the material cost, for example, and the labor cost are actually a quite low percentage compared to the overall price that includes shipping, that includes marketing, etc., and overhead. So effectively, just increasing that slightly doesn't necessarily mean that the price of a product will double or that you have to sacrifice massively on your profits.
I mean, I do agree with that point, in the sense that, you know, bigger companies like Lee's Jeans, for example, have a larger profit margin. So, you know, we can pressure them to take a little bit less of that profit margin to, you know, put more sustainable products into the market. So here's another question from Faith. And Faith goes, there's a lot of secondhand clothes that are sent back from London to Nigeria, for example. Will this help with sustainability and recycling of clothes, or will it affect the fashion industry in Africa as a whole? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that's a very, very good question, and there's a lot of different implications in this, and I think there's something about like ownership of like the waste that's being created, right? And I think a huge part of the problem that comes from exporting clothing at the scale at which it's done today is the fact that a lot of it doesn't necessarily have a massive amount of value. And actually, there's an increasing number of statistics. I've seen somewhere that approximately a third of all the clothing that's exported to African countries won't be used. It's just going to be sent to landfill. And so that's just not right? What is important is to create a system where clothing can be used more, where opportunities are created for everyone, like at a global scale. And actually, there's a few different issues that need to be taken into account. And there's no simple answer. I don't really have an answer, but just saying criteria that can be taken into account are, first, how is that impacting the local creative, manufacturing, craftsmanship aspect, right? We know that, for example, in Kenya, the massive import of clothing has nearly destroyed the entire artisanship that was existing before that happened. So there's that kind of cultural cost that needs to be taken into account. There's the opportunity that are provided for people to work. And then there's a kind of more materialistic aspect that is what's being sent there going to really be used more? And if it is, do we have the appropriate system in place so that when people stop using it, it's not going to end up in the landfill anyway? Because if you take the bigger picture of things, right, and it's a bit the same story about putting water bottles in a t-shirt. In the bigger scheme of things, if you take a step back and you say what we want is our precious materials to stay within the economy longer, if you say, well, we take that bottle, we put it in a t-shirt that's going to end up in a landfill after just a few weeks, have you really made the system better? And it's the same. If you send a t-shirt into an economy where it's not going to be collected and end up in a landfill because you not contributed to creation of infrastructure, is it really making things better? So I think it's all those different criteria that need to be taken into account. And I don't really have it's hard to have an absolute point of view, but just thinking, how do we optimize so that we can provide real opportunities for everyone involved?
I think that's really interesting. You do raise a great point in the sense that I personally believe that, these imports, they can be a good thing, but with the sheer size of them, I think they're negatively affecting our manufacturing facilities where, buying Nigerian is a thing. It's an active decision to buy Nigerian as opposed to just buying what is cheapest. And then when you also consider, the earning power of people in these countries, it also makes it harder to then say, to make that decision to then buy and then help in terms of how we're pushing sustainability in terms of, paying people and creating employment. Great. So there's another question. So we noticed there's been a gradual transition from a value chain approach to value cycles for strengthening the supply chain for garment production. What's the difference between both, and how does this impact the transition towards a circular economy?
I think that's a great question. So I think it's very much the way I understand the question is very much about how you look at some partnership basically within the supply chain, and where you look at something that traditionally is a very cost-driven decision-making process, where basically you will select suppliers based on how cheap they can make your clothing and not necessarily look much beyond that, towards a different perspective where you will create partnerships with your suppliers, where you can have a long-term approach to development and actually work with your suppliers so that progressively your and their practices can improve, right? In order to, from an environmental, from a making perspective, etc. So really working together better to actually create more value through the supply chain. And I think we're still pretty far from that being the norm, but there's definitely an important aspect of not necessarily just extracting value from the supply chain, but actually creating value with your supply chain. And when we do some studies about, if you want to make clothing that's easy to disassemble, if you want to make clothing that's easy to recycle, if you want to integrate recycled content, if you want to know what's happening to the unsold fabric, the unsold product, to the way that if you really want to move towards a circular economy that functions, you need to have a much better understanding of what's happening at the different steps of the creation of your product. And that means having a much tighter relationship with everyone who's involved in making it, so that you can have that information that helps you make better decisions.
I agree. And I'm just going to add that I feel like, the power really lies with the consumer in this conversation. If we pressure our companies to be more transparent, then they're likely to be more transparent and tell us. I mean, Kering have their EPNL. I've forgotten what the E stands for, but it basically shows the 4 stages from, the farming to the production to the, selling to this, even up to how much their carbon footprint is. how much electricity they're using, how much renewable energy they're using for their stores. And I think that it's, if you think of it that way, that is quite linear in that sense, that then they're telling you, you know, we don't want to start using mink this season because, you know, the mink, the goats, they're over herding, and now it's affecting the soil and it's affecting the planet. So I think that you're very right that, you know, we also need to keep on having these conversations at a very basic level, for people to keep on thinking and asking, and really asking these questions as to, you know, how are companies going to be more transparent in terms of sustainability and what they're actually doing, and not greenwashing.
Absolutely.
So there's another question here, and it goes, how do you think the strategies of fashion will be affected when, for example, there's a need of reselling old collections without using the sales methods?
That's a very good question. And you know, we like, there's a lot of companies asking themselves a similar question, because a country like France recently banned destruction of unsold products. So if you get stuff that you didn't sell this season and can't clear, you can't destroy it anymore. You have to find like alternatives. And that's posing a similar question, right? It's like, what do we do with that product? And I think it forces you to like think upstream and say, if from the outset you create something that can easily be recreated or transformed into a new product, then it's never going to be a problem. There might be some logistics to sort out, but nothing impossible, because it's prevented from the very way in which the product is made. And the second thing is, when a company moves from like making more products to actually creating more value with products, there's a huge aspect of that will come from how they structure their marketing, how they structure their like retail experience. And I think the way in which we start to see the fashion industry for the next 10 years is, it's an industry that's going to go through like a huge amount of disruption. Because the way in which we shop, the expectations that people have will change quite dramatically. The awareness of how big a contributor to like global challenges the fashion industry is going to keep on raising. And so that's going to really force companies to think differently. How that's going to look is going to differ depending on the different companies. We've got a ton of examples of companies who are looking into this, and more companies are actually like creating resale and celebrating their own products. I mean, Levi's is probably the latest in the journey, who's just announced that they would have like secondhand, which is really exciting. And
so so where do you think the change is going to start from? Do you think it's going to start from the top of the market in terms of luxury, or do you think it's going to start from the bottom in terms of independent, small and medium-sized businesses?
Well, I think from our experience, it's coming from both, and in very different ways. So what's kind of exciting when you're a big company in a way is that you get tons of resources to dedicate to the problem and find solutions. But the kind of like challenges you face is that it's a very big ship to turn around, and it takes years to kind of move around. But every single decision you make impacts hundreds of thousands of products, and so has that quite a big impact. But it takes a very long time to turn it around. When you're a small company, you can innovate much faster, and you don't necessarily have all the legacy and all the change that comes. So your resources might be more limited, but you've got like a more creative and agile landscape. And we see it with both. We've done some studies and conversation, and we see some young creatives who find ideas and find solutions to be more circular or more sustainable, and are constantly innovating in that direction. And equally, we see like big companies who keep on innovating but can't necessarily move at the same space. But every time they take a step, it's got a massive impact.
Sorry. Agreed. So, but someone just sent me a question specially, so I want to read that one.
Nice.
So someone is asking, you know, what do you mean by end of life? So
yeah,
if I know what we mean in terms of a linear, you know, you buy it, you wear it once, you throw it away. But if we're working in terms of circular, what would the end of life be like for these products?
So the simple answer would be like, what you want to avoid is an end of life. What you may want is end of use, but not end of life. So the life of the product will continue. And so what we've developed years ago at the very beginning of the foundation is what we call a butterfly diagram that shows all the different loops that you can go through. And you can say like, well, when you can't use it as is anymore because like it's too worn out or it's out of style, can you remake it? Is there a way that it can be either like repair or remade so it can be again used? And then when you really have exhausted everything, can you recycle it into a new product? And basically you eliminate the end of use. That doesn't happen. What you do is maintain stuff in loops that are either through like the product, its components or its materials, and it keeps on flowing.
So what would you say currently is the market share for, reused, recycled, rented? What would you say the market share of the global fashion industry is in that sustainability bubble?
That's a very good question. So initial estimates we have, and that's just very initial estimate. We're kind of working on that at the moment. So I think next year I'll have a better answer to your question. But we have early estimates that show that when you look at resale, rental, repair, remaking, you're looking at approximately 3% of the market today, which is not nothing, but is very tiny. It's very tiny. And the real question is, how can we make that 30% within 10 years? Right? Like, how can we really make sure that we can make that 30%? And then when you look at specific insights on how many products are really made using organic cotton or recycled materials and are made in a way that makes them desirable, that's really hard to find because you have to go to a level of detail that like is not necessarily like always provided. And so it's very hard to find, but it's probably less than 1% of all products that are made today.
Okay. And then that then gets me thinking about, the number of clothes that we do own. I own a lot, and I'm still buying more. The number of clothes that we do own, I mean, I keep my clothes for a long time, so I don't feel guilty about it. But the number of clothes that we do own and, the number of clothes that we throw away that end up in landfill, and what is the future of, what's our solution to landfill? How are we finding ways to make these clothes biodegradable? Are they going back into the earth? Is it going to take 1,000 years for them to go back into the soil and regenerate? So what's the life cycle for that, and how are we sort of trying to fix that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the main thing is when you've run out of use for clothing. So if like you've got like a dress or a shirt that's completely worn out and can't be used anymore, ideally it's been made in a way that makes it recyclable. And so that has like different aspects. The first aspect is the materials that make this like product need to be easy to identify. Because the main challenge when collectors and sorters try to send products to recycling is the identification of the materials, because the recycling technologies have very specific criteria on what material mix or materials they can take. And so you need to know quite precisely what the material composition of the product is. So that's the first one. And the second thing, you need that material composition to be recyclable, right? Because if you have like a blend of 10 different materials, it's not going to be recyclable. So how do you make the fabric or the material recyclable, and how can you easily identify its materials? And then that really helps make sure that they can be directed to the right recycling technology that will in turn put it back into new clothing. And what's interesting is, I don't know if you saw recently, but Renewcell, so they're a recycler for like cotton and cellulose-based product based in Sweden. They've just created a partnership with a Chinese manufacturers and a collector based in North America to create a sort of kind of scalable recycling supply chain where they would take products, send them, recycle them, and put them back directly in the supply chain. So it's this type of innovation that's really needed.
Okay. So I have another question. And this is from Yegua, and he says, do you think there's an important role for we as buyers to play in the circular economy beyond demanding the businesses we patronize become more circular? For example, do you see a role for home repairing and upcycling?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think, and that's one thing that is important and interesting about circular economy is that the transition to circular economy helps really reinvent a lot of the more like traditional practices. And so as a buyer, depending on a buyer for what type of organization, is it like wholesale or is it a buyer for a retailer where you actually like source products directly from the supply chain? But if you're like a buyer, how can you use your voice to make sure that you kind of incentivize your customers to do better, especially if they're brands? Or if you're a buyer for products, how can you work with your suppliers to actually progressively get better? And then there's definitely a space for more kind of distributed interaction where people can repair more, can like remake. There's for example, like a good example is H&M, who's put some repair shops in some of their shops, and actually allow people to either customize or repair their clothing. Nudie Jeans has been doing it for years, also offering free repair for life. Like Patagonia also had a partnership with iFixit to even help people fix it themselves should they want to. So there's tons of opportunities that can arise there. And now you've got even companies like the Renewal Workshop who can help take a jacket, for example, for the North Face that's quite worn out and refresh it so it can be either like taken back by the previous owner or sold again. So there's just tons of opportunities. And I think that's the true creative opportunity of circular economy, is that most of the opportunities that exist have yet to be invented.
I think that, and as you've said, I think that it's also important to note that, you know, especially in Europe, the changing perception of, you know, repairing your clothes or buying things that have been worn by other people. I think it's also that changing perception of, you know, the rental economy or the circular economy, which they might not be doing it for sustainability reasons, but I think that it's seeping into the subconscious of the customer to then do these. So what is your thought on, what do you think the role of technology is in terms of sustainability and recycling?
Well, technology can play like a lot of different roles. There's a role around the traceability and transparency. So using technology, and we've seen example whether like through blockchain or through embedded intelligence in the product, you can effectively create an identity for the product that makes it easy to identify. And we're talking about like collection sorting, but also about different life cycles, which makes it easy to trace and like cycle the product. So there's like definitely a huge space there. The second space is technology when it comes to innovation to make product in like lower environmental impact. So for example, lasers are used now a lot to make jeans and make them look distressed. So you can use lasers to kind of like create patterns on the jeans and create even more opportunities to create jeans that are pretty unique, because lasers is a lot more subtle in terms of what it can create on the jeans than someone with a like drill, or you know,
Yeah.
like there's more precision with the machine. Then you get technology in terms of retail environment, right? Because we've seen that with like people like Vestia Collective or Depop, actually the ability to have an app in your hand that helps you like search and send and interact with rental or used clothing in a much more seamless and easy way is actually a huge enabler of getting it to scale. And the last aspect of technology that I find quite interesting, and you were talking about like the role of people in demanding better solutions, right, is all the aspect of social media. And we've seen many campaigns work really well on social media to demand more transparency and more action from brands. So tons of opportunities for technology, depending on where you look at.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm just gonna say it now. We're gonna round up because I feel like you've been talking for a long time, but there's still so many questions that just keep on pouring in. So we'll take the last few questions. So this is from Betania, And she goes, after Africa being a continent where the fashion industry is still developing in many of its countries, from a point of view, this gives a massive opportunity for these countries to develop this industry with a basis of sustainability, different from the usual model, which is very correct. What do you think is the first step? What do you think is the first step and most simple way to start the sustainable industry having limited resources? That's a really good question.
That's an excellent question. And I think it depends on the resources that you have. So there's not like a one size fits all answer, but depending on the resources you have, are there about like the ability of sourcing dead stock fabric or old fabric that you can remake into new clothing? Is it ease of accessing sustainable materials like sustainable cotton, or is it about like actually none of that, but you can use your own creativity to make sure that when your products stop being used, you can recover them and turn them back into new products? So I think it's very much like, depending on your context, I would say don't stress out too much about what you don't have and think about capitalizing on like what you have and what you can do with those, and build like progressively on it. And I think there's also an opportunity for like grouping. And I've seen like, for example, young designers group in terms of purchasing power, so coming together in order to buy fabric, etc., because then they can have larger scale and can order with more sustainable manufacturers, or order enough fabric so they can get like some of the more specific stuff they want. So tons of opportunities. But yeah, I think getting started is more important than being perfect in the beginning.
And I think that we're also very fortunate on the continent because we have so many untapped sources, so many sustainable materials. We have our traditional fabrics, which is something that Nigerian designers really celebrate. They're made slow. It's not, you can't mass produce that. And I think that that's something that's also really special.
Yeah.
We have all these things, we have water, and I think not industrializing it would be the wrong way to go, even though we're thinking, capitalism. I think that, growing slow would probably be a better way for the continent to be a big player in sustainability. So here's a question. Do you think national governments in developed countries should get involved in sustainability practices in the fashion industry by way of tax breaks for companies involved in such a higher import duties on fast fashion? And I'm going to put that question, then I'm going to say, do you know any governments that have done this already or are doing it, apart from France, which you mentioned?
That's a very good question. So definitely government have a massive role to play, because they often government can support this type of transition.
Okay, I think that that's great. I'm very conscious of the time, and I know that it's 2 o'clock now. So I don't know, I'm just going to ask you if you have any last words, any parting.
That's a good point. I'd say really like what's important is to overall, for like this type of transition, it can look big, it can look a bit like intimidating to some extent. And what's really important is to really get started, to play around and just allow for time to help clear out ideas and not be too intimidating, not to start or wait for the perfect solution, and actually just trying and every time getting better. I think that's kind of like the most important thing to do.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being part of FBS this year. I mean, this was a great opportunity for me. I've learned so much. I've been very big on sustainability and what the future of fashion is. And I think that, on a positive note, I feel like Africa has a very big part to play in terms of, what sustainability is. We might not be in those figures now, but hopefully next year, the year after, we'll be able to see some more data on, what African designers are really doing to help sustainability and, what we're doing to basically help the planet and become a better industry, a cleaner industry. Thank you so much again, Francois. It's been lovely having you. Yeah, on behalf of the team, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. There's another session that's starting now that is on education, which is also really interesting. And that speaks to, what the future of education is in Africa for fashion and creatives. And we have some really amazing speakers that will be doing that. So thank you so much, everyone. and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.